Hello everyone, good morning, good evening, good whatever it is that you're having right now. Welcome to Gaming Mechanics. I'm Greg with your host Mark, as always.
Hello there.
And today we're talking about, wait for it, market forces in gaming. I know, exciting. We'll make it up to you next week by doing a long and GIF-laden expose on boob jiggle physics in games and why they're so important and the social... No, just kidding. No, it's going to be good. I think we got a lot of interesting stuff today for this one. As boring as it kind of sounds, Mark and I talked for like 2 hours before this, so we got a bunch of stuff for you guys.
Yeah, don't worry. We're not just going to be like charting supply and demand curves on a podcast because you can't chart things on a podcast.
Yeah, that wouldn't work anyway. And neither of us, full disclosure, I was a psychology major and did a lot of research-based work and clinical stuff. Mark was a computer science major and is now a licensed counselor himself. So neither of us are economists by any means, but so hopefully our lack of knowledge will be able to
make it less boring. And
exactly.
We're
less
not gonna
dry and slightly less accurate, but
right.
Same.
We're not gonna nerd out about the fascination of restricting supply in certain circumstances because we don't know enough technically about exactly. So we're going to be talking more about how different games have done economies and some of the relationship between the real world and gaming value, I guess.
Yeah, marketplace stuff.
We're going to start with games that are pretty closely tied to the economy. Loot box systems are really, known for this. Anything that kind of adopted Riot's free-to-play model that they popularized with League of Legends.
Were they the first one to do that?
They were the first ones to bring it to a full PC application in a big way. Nice. I'm sure they weren't the first people to do it, but to do it outside of things like Farm World, Farmville, and little like mobile apps, they were the first people to put it into a full desktop application and have it be really successful.
I suppose that shouldn't surprise me. But yeah, no, so going into kind of the idea of like completely separated from gameplay, just kind of purely cosmetic based where you just kind of buy things, more a monetization system rather than an in-game economy, right? Because for an economy, you actually need trade between players. And for these systems, like, the major MOBAs or Overwatch loot box mechanicking, that sort of stuff. There's no interaction between players for these things. You just you spend money or in-game currency, and you get your unlocks.
Yeah, so it's not even fair to call it an in-game economy. It's more just a loose tie-in between the real world and the gaming world with value. Allows you to make purchases after the fact. In most of these systems, you could get these items without paying for them, right? You could just play enough time to get enough IP in League of Legends or XP. What is the currency in Heroes of the Storm?
There's multiple ones now, but in large part gold. I mean, gold, gems.
Yeah, gold, gems.
There's all stuff you can earn in-game.
So there's lots of in-game things you can earn by playing, and then you can use that to purchase these cosmetic items, or you could speed the process up by just buying the item with money. But, and we'll talk about this a little later on, the reason why that isn't game-breaking is because the point of Overwatch or a MOBA isn't to have a bunch of cool cosmetic items. Right. That's really just a perk. And so it complements the game that you're playing instead of detracting from it. Like if you could pay to win, right? I mean, that's why that's a negative phrase that gets thrown around because that completely undermines the value of the actual game.
Yeah, totally. And it also is completely separate from any actual gameplay mechanics, right? There is purely aesthetic, and we'll get to that the next kind of example of, again, not quite a full real world economy, but still interaction between players, which would be like Diablo 3's auction house, which was notorious for being a horrible implementation of an auction house in game. Yeah. Largely, at least as far as I can tell, in my opinion, it failed in large part because it's again didn't have any real world monetary transactions that you could do, like we'll get to in a little bit with World of Warcraft or EVE Online. But what it did do was that instead of just having these quote unquote kind of harmless microtransactions that you could do that were cosmetic, which is also a really interesting thing, just as a side note, the fact that developers can have a steady source of income from something that is not, it says a lot about like players and people and why we play games, right? The fact that if games were just as simple as like min maxers or people that just really, if you only really wanted to be the best at the game, period, then you would only care about, in theory, you wouldn't want to spend certainly not money or time on getting things that didn't give you a head, a foot up in the competition.
Right.
And for these cosmetic things, they literally have completely no effect. I mean, the best ones have no effect on the gameplay itself, which is really interesting that then you have what appears to be a lot of value created via just purely aesthetic things. That matters to people. And Mark, you actually brought up this point that I thought was really, really interesting, was the fact that like even in these loot box games, like Overwatch, for example, you can buy loot boxes for money, for real money. And I don't think I've ever done that. And you can also buy it with in-game gold, as well as just there's some natural version of that. But it's really interesting that when you open a loot box and you get, say a legendary skin, something really rare, kind of one of the rarest and highest value things that people want the most, it feels really, really good. One, because you probably got something that's cool and you like, which, like I said, just as a side note, is really interesting that aesthetics matter that much to people who play games. But two, it also feels better actually. If the only way you could ever achieve it was in game and there was no way that you could actually get it for money, then Mark, you postulated that it actually feels better because there is this seemingly arbitrary monetary value attached to it outside of the game, and hence when you get it, it actually feels better than that. It feels like you kind of either worked the system or you avoided having to pay money and got it anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Which of course then fuels the gameplay loop of wanting those things more. So it's really interesting. Even just by putting a price on it, you will encourage people to get it more, even if they don't buy it with actual money. You're making investment in the player's time now, which is also something they want, as we talked about last week. So
if you open up a loot box and you get a skin that you also could have bought for $5, you feel like you've gotten $5 worth of value, even though the $5 is arbitrary. Like it's got to be relative to the rest of the items in terms of scarcity. They've got to do that pricing right. But other than that, like it's just a price tag they slapped on there. Yeah. And an example I can use is like if I said, hey, I've got this $5 apple that I'll give you. It's a good apple. It's $5. Or you can play my game. It's like a quick 15-minute little game you can play, and I'll give you this apple. And you played the game, you got the apple, you'd feel like you like did something useful with your time because this wasn't $5 you didn't spend on an apple that's supposedly good. And like it's interesting that that's similar to what you'd be doing when you're getting these skins. Like you do end up with something you want. Like an apple's not useless; you can eat it, but it's the value is probably increased. The perception of value is increased by me saying that it's like this $5 apple. I'd only give it to you for $5.
And totally. And in that case, the metaphor is interesting because on one hand, right, like the $5 is a huge markup for an apple. Apples do not cost that much and are not worth that much. But two, at least and it's even more interesting that it works the same way in a game because like if with the apple, like you said, you can eat it and it serves some value. In game, you don't. There's no. I mean, yeah, you just have the thing and it can look a certain way. It's not even the amount of worth or value that you get. Like an apple, like satisfies your hunger. It does. It's something mechanical, right? That actually does. Right. Exactly. And you have even less, and yet it still works the exact same way, which is really interesting, and I think really cool. And to know, so just as a quick side note, the loop, you can't buy specific skins with money specifically. You can't. They don't like price it that way, but you can buy loot boxes.
Not an Overwatch. Loot boxes
with money. Not in Overwatch anyway. I'm sure you can in other places. So
yeah, like Heroes, you can buy very specific things with money.
Yeah, close to. Here's is weird. They just did a new currency thing where they changed it, and you don't actually buy things with straight money now. You buy currency with straight money, and then you buy the thing, which is kind of annoying. It's actually a lot better for Blizzard because back in the day, if you'd spend like say you can only purchase say something costs like 200 gems and you want it, but you can only buy 500 gems. So then you have to buy that amount of money. Now you have 300 left over that maybe you'll never use again, right? And as opposed to the old system, they scaled the price. So you would just buy something for $2 instead of having to spend extra. It's a clever little marketing thing where you're actually spending more money than you kind of want to be. And then it also incentivizes you because you now have these extra 300 gems to spend that on something else
Right.
kind of immediately, and then when something else comes around wrong, then you have to buy another package worth of gems. It's pretty
Right.
clever actually.
Well, since we're on the topic of behavioral economics, it also serves the purpose of decoupling real money from what you're doing in the game.
Yeah,
So
totally.
there's
Doesn't feel like you're yeah.
developers will make it so that there's almost never a straightforward conversion ratio between the in-game currency and dollars, and that's so that you can't see, oh, it's 60 gems, do the math and figure out, okay, that's $4. Do I want that?
Right.
They make the math difficult to do. And studies have actually been done that show you're way more likely to spend money with a credit card than you are with dollar bills because
totally.
it feels like, oh, it's whatever. I'm not even seeing the money go away. Not a problem.
Yeah, something's leaving your hand physically. You're
Right.
watching yourself lose something.
Right. And so the more abstract you get with the currency, so like credit card, I think it's still a layer of abstractions on top of cash. A credit card that you used to buy gems, okay, now we're at 2 levels
Right
of
now we're like 3
abstraction.
levels down. Yeah.
Right, and so it gets easier and easier to spend this quote unquote money. I mean,
Right.
it's tied to money, but like it doesn't feel as much like it.
Right. Exactly. And that's a really interesting. I mean, that's like you said, the more just behavioral economics and the psychology stuff. Same thing with basically anchoring something at a completely arbitrary cost, right? Like
Right.
who's supposed to decide the value of how much of a skin, right? And how that makes you feel. Like how do you put a price point on that? Well, you don't.
Exactly.
There's no way to objectively do that. So the developer gets to do that. And then of course will change the way that you think about stuff. So that's kind of the basic opening kind of, we're just thinking about the way that players interact with marketplaces, even when there's no player interaction. It's just purely kind of the beginnings of spending real money to get in-game things. Seems like developers in general have gotten very, very good at making sure that you remove yourself from the process of spending money, as well as there's this very important thing that, like I said, I think at kind of these higher level discussions of just like pure kind of behaviorism doesn't make a whole lot of sense, except for the fact that just the fact that people really value cosmetic things very, very highly, and that
Right.
will drive them not only to spend tons of game time in that place, but also actual currency to get something that actually gives them nothing in value in some ways, right? Doesn't cost. I mean, I guess skins cost Blizzard or whoever's doing it development time and money in that regard, but
Right.
in terms of the actual value of what you're getting, it is entirely built upon aesthetic and you're
Right.
giving value to that.
Yeah, it can't undermine the core objective of the game. Like,
Yeah, I didn't finish my little Diablo. I said side note and then talked for 10 minutes. Sorry about that. So I'll finish that real quick. Yeah, basically the idea being that Diablo's auction house did not do what we're talking about. It did actually give, because when you buy an item, that's the whole point of the game of Diablo, is to get items.
right.
Is to get gear and continue on that treadmill, right? That casino dopamine factory, as Day9 put it. So in doing so, in adding this element of trade, but making it, like you said, not complement, but actually undercut the main game experience, which is to get these things.
Right.
That is, super destructive to the game. And
Yeah.
that's in large part, people think about Diablo 3 getting turned around into something really enjoyable and playable when that got removed.
Yes.
So it does seem an important part of a good system is that it complements and does not undermine actual gameplay.
And that's an
the
interesting
game.
challenge for
Otherwise, that
developers,
devalues
right?
gameplay.
Like you've got to find something then that the players care about, but they don't care about it because it's going to help them win or be better at the game or somehow do the thing that ostensibly they're playing the game to do, right? I mean, you're
Right,
playing,
yeah.
Overwatch because you want to win and you want to have fun and that's fine. But or you're playing Diablo because you want to collect items and you want to improve your character. So like you have these things that the player already cares about, but that's not what you can't sell them that. You already sold them that. You sold them that when you sold them the game. So
Right,
you got to sell them something different that they still will care about. And I think that's an interesting challenge for developers.
Totally. And like it's interesting too when you think about like, so yeah, in Diablo 2, like I didn't even play when the auction house was a thing. I got into the game after that, so I never even experienced it. But just imagine like the feeling of actually this even happened to me last night. I was playing, I was getting run through some much higher level content by two of my friends who are super, super high level. And at that level I just had to follow along, basically. Like if I got touched by any monster, I just died. But I'd get all the golden loot that dropped because I was in the same instance as them. And even then, like, so I got tons of stuff, and I got like, probably dozens of hours worth of my own slogging that would have happened. And even the loot that I got there I felt less good about it, like it didn't feel like I'd earned it to an extent.
Right.
And on the auction house, I imagine that'd be even more so, right? Like, hey, congrats, you like got all of this loot, and it's exactly what you need, and but you didn't like earn it, like you didn't actually. There's something like semi-noble about slogging through content and coming throughout the other side, and when you have all this stuff, damn it, you earned it at least. You put in the work and the time,
Right.
And that means something. And I think that's another really human element that is important and gets lost in these kind of transactional things, particularly when the economy isn't well thought out, right?
Yes.
If it's a really deep economy, like, so we'll get here in a little bit, but think about EVE Online, right? Which is like basically a fully fleshed out economy. When you buy something on the marketplace, you did actually earn that, because the only way you got to the point of being able to buy that was, that's the game. Like,
Right.
it's being successful in some semblance of form to have resources so you can get more. Like,
Right.
So anyway, the Diablo auction house was, I think, a great example of that done poorly and undermining its own rewards. It not only did it, like I say, undermine the gameplay, but it also made the rewards feel less good because you hadn't actually gotten them.
Right, you just bought them. It is in effect selling the game a second time.
Yeah.
And
no, I like the way you said that.
And then, like, when you buy the game a second time, there's no game left. Like, you win. Like, that's it. You pay to buy the game, and then you pay to win the game, and it's like after that you're done. And
Yay,
it
games.
just ended up being, well, I forked over a bunch of money to Blizzard. What did I get? Like,
no, that's that would make our podcast way shorter if that's the way games worked.
Yes.
So I bought something, and then I bought more things, and now I have them.
Now I have them.
Well,
I have a super high level character in Diablo.
Yeah,
but that was the point. Like, you can't sell the end.
Right.
You have to, and I would argue that in most games you can't even sell the means to the end, because that still feels like kind of cheap.
No, totally.
Although, to be fair, in games like WoW, they have started giving level 70 boosts, which is arguably a means to experience the end game content, or level 85 or whatever the cap is now.
It's 110.
Oh gosh, I'm so out of date.
You are, which is fine, but in that case, and that kind of goes back to our MMO discussion a couple weeks ago, I think. Or was that last week? But last week. That in that case, with WoW at least, the end game is kind of where part of the game does begin, though, right?
Right.
So that's less like getting through. Yeah, because like
there's still game left.
The content in Diablo is getting the gear. So if you just get all the gear, then you're just like, okay, now I just get to run stuff, and that'll wear off in like an hour. For WoW, it is actually more like there is this whole new world that opens up at endgame, and they're trying to make some money as well as, allow people to get there, as well as the social aspect of being able to play with. If you're getting into it and friends are already all there, then they want you to be able to play with your friend immediately and all that jazz. But yeah, you're right. That is a very, very close line.
Well, I don't want to lose anybody, but like when you get into zero cost distribution of
dude, you're losing me like immediately.
Digital goods. So like, okay, it doesn't cost Blizzard anything to give you a character that's fully max geared top level.
Right.
So it costs them nothing to, and they could get money from you to do that. But it totally destroys the game that they've made.
Yeah.
Anyway,
part of it anyway, for sure.
Interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, to the value.
Because you'll put hundreds of hours to get that same thing, and presumably your time is worth something. But
well, I mean, in that
Blizzard
case,
can do it for nothing. Or
I guess in that case it does cost them a little bit, right? Because they're subscription based, so you would have had to have been paying your subscription.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
To get that. So in that case, at least, you're right. If it was non-sub based, then yeah, all that you would have to put into that would be time, and at that point, you're paying them for almost literally nothing.
Yeah. Anyway, just a thought experiment. I wasn't really going anywhere with that, but
yeah, totally. Well, you were talking about that a little bit too earlier, like the idea of where if value is generated by the game and like players are making money off the game and the developers making money off the game, so like everyone's just making money off the game. Like there's no one. Right. It's a really interesting idea. Net obviously, like there's people more or less, but I don't think we can think of an example of that happening.
Right.
But I think it definitely is possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think within the system between the game and the developers, like money's got to be changing hands to the developers, and
Yeah.
like the players will never all be making money, but like you certainly can
Right.
get it so that some players are making real world money playing the game,
Oh, very much so.
or I guess they're avoiding spending real world money is more the way that most games work now. And so actually
Totally.
that's a good bridge into talking about WoW tokens and the way
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
WoW does um, the way that they uh, use their economy and tie their economy to the real world. So we started with loot boxes. Those are systems. It's in Team Fortress 2. It's in Overwatch. It's in I think that League has started doing loot boxes.
Oh, really?
There's a lot of games that do loot boxes, but these are really thin layers on top of basically just a real world economy. Like if Blizzard set up like a Amazon web portal where you could go spend $5 for a Arthas skin, like it would basically be the same as what's happening right now in Heroes of the Storm. Like it's it basically is just a real world economy. So we're going to move now into
Yeah.
systems that
Very
are
straight.
a little bit bigger and more disconnected from the real world economy. So like the economy in World of Warcraft, there's this large economic system, but it turns out that if you just have a large economic system with no tie to real money, bad things happen. In fact, back I think in early 2000s there was a phrase coined called mudflation, which just described the terrible things that happened to currencies in these little closed virtual economies. And well,
Right.
basically what happened was the currency hit hyperinflation and became completely worthless, and people had to find other forms of currency. So in Diablo, they came up with Stones of Jordan as being a currency because
Oh, yeah.
you had
Yeah. I
you
forgot
had to
about that.
get Stones of Jordan, and they were hard to find, and they were way more valuable than just the
Yeah, they're more
gold.
valuable than any of the game. Yeah.
Right, right. And so they had to move to Stones of Jordan as a currency because the existing in-game currency was so inflated.
Yeah, which is exactly what the kind of another point, which is real world inflation happens right when there's just more currency than demand, and that kind of happens. And in games, you have to be really careful because obviously the real world is self balancing to an extent in terms of where we'll have to actually. It's kind of the one main disconnect between a lot of these conversations and uh, just the disconnect between the real world and any game economy is the fact that real world economy exists in large part because we all like there's direct cost to it, right? There's cost to like living and surviving and continuing on. Like we need
Right.
food and we need shelter and all that jazz, and you don't need that in a game, right? Like there's to some level, unless you're paying a subscription, like once you have the game, you're not actually paying to continue to exist.
Right.
There's not that same amount of like urgency um, in it. And so in that case, money in large part can just inflate indefinitely, right? Like is there's no actual production happening, especially in some of these games where it's like kind of vendor based and not player based in terms of the people that are creating the things that are being sold. If people can just keep on earning money indefinitely without having to like do stuff or create things or buy things or sell
Right.
things, then yeah, eventually you're just gonna have way more money than there are goods, and the money's gonna become worthless.
Right. And in the real
So
world, I mean, there's people who get paid a lot of money to regulate the economy and adjust
right,
interest rates and work with banks
right,
and things like that, and that just isn't really done in MMOs. And so all players
exactly.
are running around basically printing money every time they kill a monster because they'll
Yeah,
drop
exactly.
50
Like
gold or
basically,
whatever, and then it's like, well, that is 50 gold that is new to the economy, and that creates all
yep,
sorts of
yep,
bizarre
precisely.
problems. Um,
Yeah,
and we won't bore you with all of that, but to say that most current MMOs have decided that the best way to tackle this is to tie their money at some point to something that can be exchanged for real world money also.
right. Kind of this little leak.
And so in this case, WoW tokens, you could buy them for $15, or you can buy them in game for some amount of gold, whatever the market has decided that WoW tokens go for.
I forget what it's at right now, and usually in like close to 100 grand, I
Okay,
think.
so 100,000 gold.
Maybe between 50 and 100, I think. I have no idea if that's
So
correct.
that prevents runaway inflation of your currency because it's always tied to something that has real world value. Like this WoW token is actually worth $15.
Right, precisely. And that's really important. We were talking about this actually. I was trying to explain some of this, and there was some miscommunication, but it's really important to make sure that when a new WoW token is created, that it is in fact for real money. If you don't have that, basically, so the way it works, right, is that these tokens, and they are basically a subscription of a month of game time, which is the same value as you would get normally for paying for a month of game, which is $15. So you can buy one of those from the Blizzard store for $15 of real money, and that's the only way you can start off. It has to be bought with real money, and then you get that item in your shop, and then you can resell that in game to people for gold. And so then the market in game can fluctuate up and down depending on how well. Can you hear? Do you have a dog over there?
I do. I'm sorry. I'm gonna let her out. I think.
Oh no, it's fine. I didn't know there was a dog. Mark's house sitting this week, and I didn't know there was a dog. Anyway, tell him hi and that he's a good boy. But anyway, so the point is that's really important, because if you didn't do that, if the token didn't start off as being spent with real money, then you would have, if you could go to the WoW store and buy one directly from Blizzard for gold, that's actually really not okay, because then you have basically, again, gold that can be made without any money. It's just time, right. Value that can be generated in game, purchasing something that is in fact a real world equivalent, and that would just annihilate the market, right? That would make the cost of WoW tokens would just plummet, because suddenly they don't have any actual value, and then you kind of defeat the purpose of, like you said, the stabilizing factor of the in-game currency being tied to real market currency. Another side little funny story. This happened, I think it just came out 2 days ago, which is funny because we've been planning on doing this. But the WoW gold, based on this conversion rate, right, of however much, tens of thousands of gold equals 15 real dollars. Mm-hmm. The WoW gold actually passed Venezuelan currency in value. So it costs more in Venezuelan currency to buy a subscription to WoW for a month of $15 than it would in gold. That's kind of weird. That's a weird little like reality leak.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And as far as I understand it, Venezuela is not in a great place right now, in a lot of ways. But that's insane, right? That we have this economy that is semi-robust enough in some regard to surpass a real-world economy. Mm-hmm. So I think it just goes to show that even these very simple, like, price control, like, WoW tokens will always be $15. They are. Everyone is exactly the same amount of worth, so that's controlled, and there's only one of them. It's the only way to interact with real money. So it's a very, very simple type of economy, but it's also robust enough to actually, cause real-world comparisons to actual countries.
Right, and the only real thing that you have to tie the currency to is just something that players are going to care about that really can't be gotten anywhere else.
Right.
So in this case, the players care about subscription because they want to keep playing the game. And there's no other place to get subscriptions other than to pay $15 to Blizzard, or if you have a year long, you probably can get a slight discount on that. But
yeah, they discount it a little bit.
So that's an important facet. You can't just tie in a real world currency to any arbitrary thing. This also is a function of acting as a currency sink, because you pay $15,000, 100,000 gold. And then you burn this token. It actually leaves the system. And so that means another person's got to spend $15 in order to bring another token into the system. And so you're creating a scarcity of the tokens, which means there's going to be demand for the tokens.
Exactly.
Which means that they are going to be highly valued. Anyway.
And the other important thing about having one of these that works is that it doesn't overlap anywhere else. There's nothing else in the game that can do that, right? There's no other item or set of reputation grinds or anything that you can do to get game subscription time other than this one thing that exists. And so one, that makes it, like you said, worth something. And two, it doesn't create scarcity elsewhere in the game. So it's a really elegant thing, actually. They introduced this huge, seemingly very important change to the game, and yet the way the game plays, if you went in and played it and didn't play the auction house at all, it actually changed very, very little in terms of the way it didn't interact with other market forces, actually, other than the fact that the way people buy and spend gold is different now, so it drove prices up, because now you have this really effective way to make gold. In general, it didn't really affect the way the rest of the things got sold, because it didn't interact with them. It wasn't competing in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, right. And
So that's the
that
point.
actually brings me to another point about one of the problems with auction houses are items are in very, very steep competition with each other.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
So
yeah. That's a good point.
you have actually items that are very, very rapidly depreciating in value. If you think about the best item you could possibly get on this expansion of WoW, um, and then compared to an okay item that you can get on the next expansion, actually the one in the next expansion is probably better, and it's easier to get. So although you
Right.
worked your butt off to get this best item in the current expansion, you could just get an okay item in the next expansion, and it'll be just as good. So
Right.
as soon as that happens, okay, you have this item that is easier to acquire and it's better. Well, that's going to completely kill the market for this really hard to acquire item. It's only going to have
Yeah.
like, if it has any value, it's only just going to be like novelty value of like, oh yeah, this was really hard to get and I have it. Like,
Right.
you're not
It's
actually
just
going to use it for anything. And so that's
yeah.
going to, in terms of an auction house, that's going to just destroy the value of that item. Like, nobody is going to pay gold for that unless they're just like a rare item collector.
Right. Which is interesting in that it was something we were talking about kind of last week again, and again it came up with the aesthetics. But that actually, I don't know if we should write that off quite as quickly because like that is a apparently that's apparently as I'm some higher order being I'm not, but
Apparently.
that is something people peasants no that's what that matters a lot to people. People do actually love hunting for old. I mean you see that in WoW with mount hunting. Really rare old mounts or stuff from previous expansions that's way hard to get now is really important and cool. So that's I think that's interesting because yeah, you're right in terms of again that like pure mechanical sense of yeah, this is just legitimately in every way worse statistically than like a legendary from the last expansion is now worse than a rare in this
Right.
expansion. But there is some value still to having that legendary because yeah, it's a status symbol. It even just internally, even outside of the game, just knowing that you have that as a player makes you feel good. So there's interesting and that like mechanically that also is different from the real world, right? It's hard to compare auction houses to the real world because like so even in technology, right? Like when the iPhone 8 comes out, the iPhone 7 won't be the next best thing. The iPhone 8 will probably in large part, unless they really mess it up, be pretty much specifically better in every sense of the
Right.
word. Um, but there's one, most people can't afford new technology when it releases. But two, the iPhone 7 still is a fantastic piece of technology. It still is able to do all the old things that it did,
Right.
right? Like reality doesn't scale up, in the same way that like content in MMOs would scale up, where suddenly you need something better to keep on
Right.
existing.
And it isn't as one dimensional. Like, if I get a better weapon in MMO, like that pretty much helps me with everything. Like
Yeah, in
so
large
much
part.
of the game is combat and being able to run dungeons or run raids that when an
Yep.
improvement there is like of course you're going to take it. Whereas
Right.
in the real world, you might forego an improvement to your phone so that you can improve your kitchen or repaint your living room or upgrade
Right.
your car
Exactly.
or I mean I don't know what you would want to spend money on, but like there's a lot of things, a lot of dimensions of improvement that, and I would say
Yep.
MMOs actually suffer from a lack of dimension most of the time. In
Well, at least the theme park ones,
Yes, certainly the theme
to
park
to
ones.
reiterate our
Certainly the theme park
our
ones.
complete and utter coming down on one side of this argument.
We just
It was
wanted to
supposed to
come
be way
back
more
for one
nuanced.
last shot at theme park MMOs.
Put another bullet in the corpse.
Exactly. Double tap.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, but no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's very true. I think the other interesting thing was you were talking about this a little bit, but the idea of like incidental value or accidental value. We were talking about Final Fantasy 14 and its marketplace and how that auction house didn't seem to work too
Mhm.
well. Because I was talking about like obviously the Diablo auction house, we kind of identified some reasons why that didn't work, but like in general, I don't think auction houses in game where you have this completely closed in game economy of people being able to put up items, certain items that they buy, and then they can sell them at different price points and yada yada yada. I don't think that's a bad idea necessarily if done well. And you're talking about how Final Fantasy, which I know nothing about, their auction house kind of sucked actually in that regard. So you want to talk about that for a sec?
Yeah, so in Final Fantasy XIV, the auction house is pretty notorious for just being really competitive and not like in a good way, not in like a when producers compete, consumers win because
Yeah.
the problem is in
Something out of a Reagan era like propaganda.
The problem is in MMOs, or at least in Final Fantasy 14, everybody's a producer. Like, because
Right.
some people might just up their crafting skills for kicks. Like, I mean, why not?
Right.
It's something to do in the game. It improves your character. It allows you to get better items. So, it's the problem is that you might actually get an item on a way to another item that somebody has spent a long time trying to produce or craft or farm for, and you don't value it at all because you accidentally got it. Like, imagine coming home from the grocery store and accidentally finding $10 or a
Oh no, more than that. You find like
full suit of armor,
uncut, beautiful
right?
diamond.
Yeah.
You know,
Imagine you get like a
on the
gem.
ground.
Like, how quickly would gems
Right. Right.
depreciate if people found them sometimes on the way home from the grocery store? Well, this is the
Yeah.
case with
Precisely.
some MMOs, right? Like, I'm trying to get to an
Right.
end of a dungeon. In order to do that, I've got to kill 40 mobs. Okay. So, one of these mobs dropped a ruby. Okay, well, I wasn't really looking for a ruby, but now I have this ruby. I might
Right.
as well put it on the auction house.
Right.
Like, I accidentally acquired all this value, and I don't
Right.
really want it. And it's totally different than like anything that would happen in the real world.
Yeah, totally. And that can be controlled for in game, right? In theory, you should be trying to really avoid or make unbelievably rare these times that happen where you get this ridiculously high value thing with very, very little work. Or you make it you balance the other side of professions and make those sort of things easier to do, so it's less of a time sink for them. But the idea is, right, if you put something up on the auction house, and someone who has the same item but did almost nothing for it, they just need to make they have no sunk cost in it, right? They'll make any profit they can
Right.
out of it, and the best way to ensure that is to make it the most competitive thing on the auction house. So they just undercut you by what, like 10% or
Sure.
whatever, and they'll probably sell their thing. And as opposed to if you have these crafting professions where it's really difficult to make these things, you actually do have a sink of both time and in-game resources where you have to gather things or find things or construct things. Then suddenly getting undercut by someone else feels really crappy. But like you said, if it is this system in the game that does not really well regulate what people can find and the amount of effort that would go into that, kind of the cost, the resource equivalency there, then yeah, an auction house will be a friggin' mess because suddenly you have all these people that are able to just play off everyone else at no cost to themselves.
Right.
And that would be super, super frustrating. You said that's not real competition. That's this weird alternate reality. You know, like you don't actually have
Right.
to
Where people poop rubies.
be anything.
And it's like
Yeah, you don't even. That would be the worst. That would be the worst of those realities that we could have come up with. So I'm glad we just hit rock bottom immediately. But, but yeah, no, seriously. So that's just this really bizarre thing, and that makes sense.
Right. So
Across
those
the
sorts of
board.
auction houses are just going to be doomed to be failed and frustrating for people trying to make any sort of money.
Yeah, does not incentivize you at all.
You get undercut 10% 9 times, and you're not going to really be making any money. Like, the price is just going to plummet. And then,
Yeah, exactly.
of course, there are people who are new to the market who really don't know what the item's worth, and they look at the auction house price, and they don't realize that actually it's been slashed 10 times. And so then they think that's what the item's really worth, and everything just, goes sideways from there. There's also one other point about auction houses, which is that there's no problem with reselling items in MMO because items don't age and they don't get damaged
Oh,
and
yeah.
they don't wear. Most MMOs, I realize some MMOs do have like a wearing system on gear, but usually it
Yeah,
can
but
be
that's
pretty.
that's really like tertiary at this point. It's really easy
Right,
to
it's
repair
really
stuff.
cheap to repair. And so, like, the reason I might not buy a secondhand electronic is because I want a new one that I know is in good condition. But that doesn't matter about if you're buying a great axe in an MMO. Like, it's going to be the same exact quality as what you'd get from a vendor. It's the same item.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
that is another interesting difference between the real world and the.
Yeah, they kind of have this infinite like the ability to the idea of a new item isn't really a thing, right? Except maybe initially at release when no one has gotten one yet. But even past that, right? Like if something is brand new that's been out for a long time, you still want a new one, right? In the real world. And in games, there's no sense of desiring a fresh item or not. They're all identical. So that's a really good point, is that there's no value degradation there.
And in MMOs, you're living in a world where everything you get from a garage sale is just as good as what you get like off the shelf name brand, and
Yeah.
you also find rubies on the way home from work.
And you poop them.
So this is the sort of crazy economic BS that they're dealing with when they're trying to balance these economies.
Yeah, precisely. For as many great ways that there are these equivalents, yeah, I think highlighting the metaphors of what it would actually be like in the real world really gives a sense of how far away it is from something resembling real world. Which should bring us to EVE Online, which is in my small amount of research I've done slash just being in the gaming world. EVE is in large part, I mean, it has the reputation for being basically called like Excel Online instead of EVE. But that's because it is pretty. I think it's by miles to the closest we've come to see something that it resembles a real world economy in a game. In fact, that is basically the game. I mean, that's not entirely true. I think it's a huge part of the game, if not like a plurality of the game.
Oh, it's a huge motivating factor too for a lot of the activity that goes on.
Right. Think about like the politics or the war or that sort of stuff. But in large part, that's all driven.
I think people could quibble over whether power or money is prime, but like one leads to the other pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. How do you separate those out? Which is another great example of it mirroring. So so we're thinking about this and just EVE outside of all of the intricacies of their economy, but the things they've done well, some of the things we've been talking about, like infinite versus infinite, or finite versus infinite resources. In general, there is on the back end, right? The sectors, the universe replenishes resources to a small extent, but there is a level of you can run out of resources in a sector, you can mine it dry, and two, the whole in-game economy is based off of player-made things. So like when you vendor something in Skyrim or Diablo or WoW, it disappears entirely, right? Like these vendors can accept an unlimited amount of items, and they will always pay you money for them. That's not how the world works. In this game, in EVE, if you sell something, you have to sell it to a person, then they have to have that thing, and they have to decide what to do with that thing. They can either get rid of it, they can trash it, all that sort of thing. But in general, it's an internally consistent economy, right? It has links to the real world. I think they might have been one of the first people to do this with they're called plexes.
Yeah, they were one of the very first. I think they may have been the first to realize that this was a fantastic way to solve some of the classic MMO inflation problems.
Right, which is very similar to a WoW token in terms of it's basically an item that grants game time. One interesting thing about plexes, which I think is brilliant, this kind of is a slight side note, but is that they can be they're an item that you have and you can lose them in game. They can be destroyed. This was changed in a patch, and there's a notable example. If you didn't check any of these out, and last week I think Mark put up some of the links to some stories in EVE on the Facebook page, which are fantastic. But there's another one that I found, which was basically a cargo carrier holding like 74 plexes, which was equivalent to like I think somewhere around $1,200 in real world money as associated with ISK, the in-game currency. That got scouted and attacked by pirates and destroyed, and all of them disappeared. And in that case, that's a fascinating thing because that was $1,200 worth of money that CCP, the developer, basically got for free. Like no one redeemed those, no one did anything with them. That was money that they sold as like a gift card, right? Where like 90% of gift cards don't get used. You sell them, the company gives you the cost of a piece of plastic basically, and then if they don't get redeemed, then nothing happens. Right. So that's a brilliant little quirk of the EVE economy that these things can actually be lost and destroyed.
Here's an interesting thought experiment. Apparently I'm full of these today, but imagine CCP hiring pirates to destroy Plex in game. That's actually a profitable venture for them.
Very much so.
If they're effective enough at destroying Plex, they actually are making money that way.
It would also be super corrupt.
But
no, I mean that could totally be a thing. That would be so. If CCP did that, that would be rough. If a player-driven corporation was paying pirates, and this actually happens too. Like in some of those stories, like a lot of the armies are in fact mercenary gangs that get employed by big corporations that need them. Anyway, but if a corporation or an alliance paid a group of pirates to hunt down another alliance's Plex and destroy those and all the value they get out of them, that would suck, but that would also be entirely
above board.
Oh yeah, dude, that would be par for the course for EVE, in terms of strategic thinking, and of course that would benefit CCP too, but but it would also hurt them.
I think that's brilliant by CCP to profit off of the PvP already inherent in the game.
Yeah, that is That's pretty clever, actually. I hadn't thought about that. But again, it really it goes it plays into the fantasy of the game still. This and it makes the stakes a lot higher, right? Like obviously having any number of huge in-game resources that are super important in Eve as well. But there's got to be another even like we were talking about abstraction. Like there's in any game that has you know real world money links, there's always going to be a conversion rate of the in-game economy to it if you can buy it with in-game economy. And so obviously any piece of equipment or ship in Eve has a real world conversion, but it's just a lot farther. The Plex is the closest thing, is the least amount of, separation between those two ideas.
Right.
And so it makes it way easier to say, hey, like $1,200 worth of Plex got destroyed, as opposed to being like, yeah, I lost these crafting materials and I guess I could calculate out how much it would be, but it would take me a second. And it just is another kind of mental step that you have to do. So yeah, I'd say that the Plex operations are way more intensive and kind of plays into that fantasy of this, kind of high drama-esque real world situations of intensity and drama. I've said drama and intensity like 4 times. That's apparently the 2 words that I associate with Eve so much that they have ruled out other adjectives from my brain.
That's I think that's a fantastic point that you make, though. What we said earlier about how developers can get you to spend real money by abstracting it away and making it into gems, you actually can achieve the reverse effect where you can get players to feel the tension of risking real money by removing those abstractions. When you're dealing with an item like Plex, which has a very clear exchange between real world US dollars and ISK, you get the tension of actually moving around $15 or transporting it or trading it.
Totally.
Even though it's an in-game item.
Yeah. So the other interesting thing that Eve does is, so they have an in-game economist on staff at CCP who, it's unclear to me if that means that they are a actual real-world economist that with real-world training that keeps track of it, or is someone who's so well-versed in the game's economy and understands that so well they try to keep it. But
I believe it is the former, but
yeah, I would assume that would have to be, especially with the complexity of E's economy. They might kind of converge,
right?
But so that's super important. They do keep kind of a pseudo like Fed, like in on staff to ensure that. And I don't know how CCP, one of CCP's big mandates is the developers that they interfere as little as possible with the game, and so I don't know how much the economist actually edits things or changes things. But regardless, having someone on staff to actually ensure that it keeps moving is just kind of speaks to the depth of it. As well as this is something to be avoided. Like this is another thing I found that Ultima Online, one of the really early MMOs, tried something similar actually way back even in its own beta stage, basically, where it was trying to do something akin to another real world economy where like anyone who had a shop, basically there were shops were owned by players and shops had to run their own like payroll. So it'd be people like they would run like a small business where they'd have people who were hired who'd go out and get things for them and bring them back. Then they'd get a portion of the profits and yada, yada, yada. And what ended up happening was apparently it didn't make it out of beta because roughly 90% of the wealth ended up in 10% of the player base, which is 2 things. 1, it's not fun. 2, it's also a little bit getting too close to reality sinking in, which is super not fun.
Right.
But I think it's just absolutely fascinating. It's very difficult to make an economy, particularly like an attempt at a capitalistic economy, work, unless you have this massive labyrinth system. And as simple system as Ultima apparently failed in that regard and had kind of the natural reaction to capitalism. Eve, I'd be fascinated to see how some of that wealth distribution is. Probably be similar, but at least it's still. You can rise through the ranks, kind of regardless of who you are or what you are, and make it regardless of what you're doing. So, I think
that's one of the classic problems with an economy, though, is like you can give somebody a level playing field to start with, but you can't make it level at the top. Communism tried that, and it turns out you just remove all incentive for people to do much of anything.
Yeah.
So
yeah, to an extent, for sure. I mean, it's a really difficult thing, especially in the real world, like we said, when we have really high life and death stakes to it, as opposed to a game world. Right. And that's the other thing is that we were talking about, like in theory, kind of what are the purpose of games? They're to connect and to enliven and to experience something that you wouldn't otherwise. But that also shouldn't be a complete substitute for reality in theory, right? Like if you did want, yeah, a complete real world economy in game, then yeah, there'd be some serious. Not everyone would have an equal shot at it. It would probably be not fun for most people,
Right.
in large part. And that's not the point of a game. Now Eve has dipped as far into that realm as I think any game has. And there's a reason for that. That's why it has super niche, and not a lot of people actually wouldn't enjoy it because of that level of brutality.
Right.
That kind of mirrors reality in some places. But past that, it's still, I think there is still a veneer, or at least something past that makes it more fun than reality. Otherwise, people would just do that. Maybe it's just that you get to buy spaceships instead.
Right.
Of,
you get to explore space. I mean, that's pretty cool.
A TV. That's got to feel like a better payout. So.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I guess I'm just going to keep on comparing topics about Eve unless you cut me off here, which I'm totally fine with. But the other thing is, right, like as opposed to any other game that we've talked about so far in terms of economy, there's very, even in WoW with the WoW token, there's almost no other, in fact there really isn't, place where you need to spend in-game currency to make in-game currency, right? Like in large part you buy things with value, and then you that's the way you spend your currency. You spend it to sinks as opposed to like investments that then have return on them. And that's exactly what Eve does. That's I mean, there's full banks. Again, if you go back to some of those links, there's tons of bank fraud and Ponzi schemes that have happened that were, as outside observer, hilarious and incredible, but probably deeply painful to people involved. But in that game, you do very much have to spend money to make money, which is, again, very, very similar to the real world. And the last part is that, in large part, a single person in Eve can't, like, for the top end stuff, like, the Titan spaceships, or huge carrier based, or infrastructure for warp gates and sovereignty and stuff like that. That can't be done by a single person. Like, you can't do that as a player. You need to do that as a corporation, or as a group of players, or even as an alliance. Like, no single player has the resources to actually do that. You need a group of people, very similar to how most people outside of billionaires couldn't actually finance a building to be built, right? Like a company has to do that. And so again, that's some really interesting mirrors to reality that Eve is able to accomplish. So I think, like I said, the veil between reality and game is thinnest with Eve Online.
Right, but that is to say the comparison between the two is very direct. But that's not to say there's a lot of transactions between the real world and the game, which is what we were talking about with the loot box system.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So in a loot box system, the difference is very thin because it's basically just the real world economy, but branded in a certain way. In Eve, it functions like the real world economy, but it really has very little tie other than the Plex attachment to the real world. And let's actually move now into talking about systems that have literally no connection to the real world. You talked a little bit about the way that Ultima did theirs. I don't believe they were at any point tied to real world money. There's also a couple interesting examples from State of Decay and X3 that are interesting economic models in-game that don't tie into real world currency at all.
Yeah, totally. I was again looking through some stuff and trying to find interesting in-game marketplaces that had zero, actual monetary connection to it. The way that people do that is also it seems like the worst way to do it that I came across and was basically economy, quote unquote economy, is player progression, like just earning money in order to get to the next step of things, so you can buy the thing that you need to get to the next place.
What was a game that did that?
I think that's really most games in large part, right? Like the idea of I don't know, like I'm thinking about kind of like adventure games where you need a certain amount of money or upgrade points to unlock your next ability.
Right.
And then you spend it and it goes away, and then you have your next thing, and then you can go and now you can suddenly fight this group of enemies that was too hard before.
Right.
The idea of, like the Arkham games or Shadow of Mordor, that's kind of the way those work. Where there's no actual trading with anyone. It's just you spend it on yourself in large part.
Right.
Or it's kind of simple RPGs, I suppose, right? Where gold is just a resource to be managed, and not for like in a market sense. The only thing you do with it is to get yourself better things, right?
Right.
So it's more content gating than anything else.
Yeah, it's more just like to
Or
make
like
sure you can't just go out and buy like a crap ton of good items.
precisely, yeah, no, exactly. No, that was exactly the way it was put. Was that it's a way to gate things, as opposed to a way to open up. It's a way to get to more parts of the game. It isn't part of the game itself. Like it's not one of the main mechanics.
Hmm.
So I think that's kind of the way economy tends to be used in games, which is fine. That's I mean
Sure.
that's not every game has to be that way, but some interesting other ones, in large part, kind of the open world games. It seems need a little bit more to that to succeed.
Right. I think that's
Kind of
part
make you
of
feel
the,
immersive.
yeah, exactly. That's part of the immersion is that you've got to have
Mhm.
something a little bit more than just like, oh, this vendor will take an infinite number of, dirty socks and pay me money for them.
Right. Yeah. Precisely. And because that's the goal of those games, right? Like in Batman Arkham City, I'm not going to that game to try to get a sense of the economy of Arkham City. Like this super prison. Like that's not the point. So that makes sense. Um, but in these open world games that are asking you to sink part of yourself into it, and the attraction to it should be, I want to be able to lose myself a little bit into this. Then yeah, it would make sense that having a little bit more robust ones. So some of the cool ones I came across were, like you said, this uh, a series of games by a company called EgoSoft that can best be described as just X. There's X1, X2, X3, and they each have subtitles. And those are basically kind of spacefaring uh, role playing games, I guess, in large part, with a pretty heavy stance on economy. The cool thing that X3 did was that in the game you are, again, there's kind of this closed economy where instead of the vendors kind of doing their own thing and you just exist for them, um, the NPCs you're actually in direct competition with throughout the game, which sounds really cool. So they're working their businesses, and their prices will affect what you can sell, and so on and so forth. So that just is another little added layer of gameplay there, as opposed to just having these static NPCs that do their thing. Now you actually have to take them into account as you're trying to figure out how to make money, which is a really cool idea. And then the other part of it was that they, within that economy, you can actually they put into the game automation, so you can automate your own production facilities and factories and do that, which isn't a huge deal. But the really cool thing is that, again, in the game client, they actually have, if you know, I don't know what language it was, but if you have computer literacy, they actually program and write code for your factories and for your own production cycles and economy to get a leg up on the competition. Which I don't think I've heard of a game do that
No,
outside
that's
of like just
fascinating.
direct modding.
Right.
But that's a cool idea to have some crossover there.
Yeah, to be able to get an economic advantage because of a real world skill in the game is, yeah, that's really interesting.
So that one's less like a really clever way. I mean, I think it is clever. It's less a particularly advanced way to do it, as well as just like cool ways to interact with an existing economy. It doesn't seem like that game's economy is like particularly uh, rich or intuitive, or maybe not intuitive, but like really expansive. But there's really cool ways in which you deal with it that seem to set it apart.
Well, having NPCs
Um,
that compete with you directly, I think it's a way of the game doing self-regulation, right? Because the NPCs are controlled by the game, and
right.
so you can't sell this item for a ridiculous amount of money because the NPCs will compete you down to, less money. Um,
Yeah, totally.
and so that's a way that developers can add little economy manager, automatic economy manager bots to their game through the NPCs, as opposed to just
Yeah.
the dumb bots that will always sell and always buy at the same prices.
Right. And like I said, I haven't played that game, and so I don't know exactly how well that works. Even that would require, some pretty darn good AI. Otherwise, you'll just kind of be able to figure out how to beat the system, like we talked about
Yeah.
before, and just kind of cheat them. Um, so, and then the other interesting idea was, again, outside of resource management. This is another game called State of Decay, which is an open world post-apocalyptic zombie survival game. Which is a really long thing to say for as common it is to have to say that.
Yeah, right. Can we just get
We
can
should
we
have a,
just get like a shorthand for that?
I know, get an acronym. Anyway, but it's one of those, and apparently one of the far more successful ones. I think it released in the later aughts. And the way that one works is, again, and this is cool because this one actually very much complements the fantasy of the game, which is being in a world post apocalypse. God, I just
Whoa!
know,
Never saw
ooh,
that coming. And
I know, yeah. But if only there was a long, drawn out name that we could have to describe exactly what we're talking about. But anyway, the idea being that, currency loses all value at that point, the economy's gone. So what is left is kind of bartering for sure. And I think that's the way that item trading works, is large part. There's a value associated with an item, and to get other items, you have to trade the item itself, as opposed to sell it and then use currency to get it.
Right.
But the other thing in a world like that, which is semi plausible and reasonable to me, is like your influence, your reputation in the world would also be a really heavy resource to use. So they have this influence-based thing where, depending on the things you do and even the items you have, it's kind of this cool like banking thing. If you have a lot of items stashed in your like safe box, then people know that. They know that you have all these things, and that'll actually increase your influence. And if you take things out of your safe box, that requires influence to do, right? It's kind of this like communal thing where you're playing in. Same thing with recruiting followers or making additions to your home base. All those things cost influence, which isn't something that you can get from picking up things and selling them. It's something it's completely due based, and it's the way you act, which is cool. And then the last part is this kind of fame mechanic on top of that, which is you have this other set ranking that, depending on how much influence you use in a day, if you get under your fame ranking, say your fame's like 1,000 and you've used like 100 influence, or you're down to 100 influence overnight, or like when whatever time mechanic turns over, my understanding is that you then will increase back to your maximum fame and influence. So that's the way it replenishes itself. Or if you somehow get more influence than your fame was during the day, you'll reduce back down to your fame overnight.
Right.
Which is an interesting idea, that your long-term reputation actually matters as well in terms of what you can do in the world. It's not just kind of this day-to-day thing, but it's this ability to build a reputation in the community that would actually allow you to get more and hold on to more influence, which is a really, really cool idea. That's bringing kind of social dynamics into an economy, which again I think does really well to match exactly what the fantasy of that game would be with the actual dynamics of the gameplay. So those were the two most interesting marketplace economies that I found.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to structure an economy. Like, I like it when games try to explore different economic models other than just the normal supply and demand, like systems that we're all very familiar with, or capitalism, or just like these really. This again, they're interesting, they're complex, but they're very familiar. Whereas the idea of having like a reputation economy, or like this interesting like cyclical and bounded economy that you have in State of Decay, where like you can get more quote unquote like money or influence for the day, but unless you increase your long term fame, it's gonna go away. Like,
right.
So you've got to be thinking about the long term, or maybe at some point you just need a really short term gain, and that's fine. But it just functions a lot differently than just your standard. You get assets, you put assets in a bank. Later on, you spend those assets for things you need. Like, that is something that it's not as interesting to me because it's just been done a lot in the real world.
Yeah, totally. And then if you think about like games that are like really popular and really good, in other ways, like Skyrim, right? Like you never think about the economy in Skyrim, right? Like that doesn't excite you about that part of the game, which makes sense because they didn't spend much time on it. They spent their time doing other things, which is super important because that's the reason people play that game. But yeah, I did really like the idea of having, and particularly the State of Decay one sounded really cool. I've played neither of those games. I've just read about them. So if I got stuff wrong, just the idea though of a reputation based economy, and then actually like that, I could see that at a pitch for a game developer, and then you're like, okay, great. So how the frick do we actually like make that work in terms of a game?
Right.
And the way that I heard read the mechanics to work seemed really, really pretty cool and intuitive. I'm sure there's issues with it, but yeah, it's a really different take on it than I think I'd seen very nearly anywhere else.
Cool. Well, if you guys know of any games that just have interesting economies or economic systems that you want to throw our way, that would be, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us. I'm mark@gamingmechanics.net, and Greg is greg@gamingmechanics.net. And let us know what you think. If there are any people who have trained economic training or analysis that they'd like to contribute, we'd absolutely be fascinated by that, as long as we can understand it. And we really hope that you enjoyed listening. So thanks for tuning in. And this is Greg and Mark signing out.
So long.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @Gaming Mechanics, or Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.